Welcome to the Startup Grind.
I don't think Joanne needs much introduction, and we're really going to get into her whole background, but she's an extremely prolific angel investor. She's got over 85 companies now in her portfolio. She's been investing for 8 years. I'm extremely, extremely excited to welcome Joanne Wilson to the stage. All right. Thanks, Joanne. Thanks for coming.
Sure.
How's your, is your microphone on?
It is on. You ever hear me? Yes.
Everybody here? Yeah? Awesome. Great. So why don't we jump right in? We'll do a little background on you before we really get into Q&A or anything.
Okay.
I would love to... Sorry. Am I on? Yep. Great. I would love to start just if you can you give us your pitch? Can you give us your...
My pitch?
Yeah.
I haven't pitched anyone in a long time, although I will say someone years ago, this was 98, 99. And I had left a company. It was in the internet industry. There was a guy that I had known who had, it was a pretty huge magazine at that point. Now it's nothing. And he had, heard that I had left, and he called me and he's like, really want you to come in, blah, blah, blah. I was like, or whatever. And this woman called me and she said, John asked me to call you. Can I have your resume? And I was like, you must be kidding. I was like, I don't have a resume. I'll give you my 2-minute pitch. And then, of course, as I had, had 3 kids and I was running this business and went through the whole drill, and she's like, okay, fine, good enough. That was it. I didn't take the job, but it was kind of hilarious.
That's got to be, that's got to feel good when people are coming to you and asking for something from you rather than you going out and pitching people on yourselves.
Yeah, that's a good, I never really thought about it that way, but yeah.
Well, do you think there was a moment in your life where that flipped? Was there a point where you were going out and really trying to push your own agenda and try to convince people to work with you? Because I assume it's quite the opposite now.
It was never, no. I never had to go out and search. Yeah. It's a funny thing when you're interested in investing in someone, how they find you.
Yeah.
But also, I had started blogging. So I had started blogging 13 years ago with this, I guess, romantic vision that I didn't want. I got off the train. I sort of stayed home with our kids for a couple of years for a variety of reasons. And also the entire internet had completely imploded. I mean, it wasn't like there were all these jobs out there, and it wasn't like you were starting a company, people were closing companies. And so I stayed home with our kids for a while, sort of rethinking what's next? And, blogging sort of came into play. And my husband had been blogging, I think, for a big 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And he's like, you should try this. You might really like this. And I thought, this is a great opportunity to do something that it's only mine.
Yeah.
And we'll see what happens with it. And I think the few people that were blogging in that point, we all kind of knew each other.
Yeah.
And then over time, I started, there wasn't Discuss then. So the only way that people would find me is they would email me. And I sort of became this sort of magnet, particularly from women, like a chick magnet, and about I love what you're writing, and I'd like to talk to you about my business. And then it sort of, escalated.
That demonstrates very much the sense of experimentation. Do you consider yourself to be sort of a continual experimenter? Are you always trying new things?
I am always trying new things. I love change.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I believe that your first sort of official angel investment was one that you were very passionate about even before you found out they were raising money.
Yeah. I was reading Curb Media and Eater and Raft a few times a day. And I was obsessed with not only the content, but I was obsessed with the business model because, this is the beginnings really of the next generation of the web. And I was convinced that this is how we were going to take in content as we move forward. And the web started to sort of create all these new businesses. And what's interesting about that generation too is that the people that were starting these businesses versus the first generation, they actually grew up with computers.
Right.
And so the differential is that they were very understood how businesses could be built on them or how they could use them to change their lives. Whereas the first generation was more like, holy shit, this is really interesting. We all got to get into this thing, you know, and which is why a lot of them exploded. And so, you know, watching what they were doing with content, I thought was super interesting. And I didn't believe that magazines were going to die. I thought they would take on a different life. And then, you know, my husband's like, they're raising money. And I was like, wow. And he's like, you should invest in them. You'd be good at that. And I was like, okay. So I called Locke, and that was it.
Yeah, that's great. So I just lost my train of thought for a second. You're looking at all of these, if we can take a step back and understand sort of the headspace that you were in when you made your first investment, what had your career been up to that point? You'd taken some time to work away from work to be with your kids, which is obviously a big occupation in and of itself. How did you decide that this was something that wasn't just going to be a hobby, but it was something you were going to take more seriously?
You know, I'm not that thoughtful. To be perfectly honest, which is probably why I'm a great risk taker. Like I'll go down a street, you know, in your head, and you're just like, oh my God, this is not going to work. Veer right. And it's not this thought process like, wow, I'm going to start angel investing. This is being next career for me, and I'm going to grow this thing. It was just like, I just started walking, and then before I know it, I was running, and then I was running a marathon. You know, I think that's really how I've actually, anything in my life has sort of been like that. There has not really been any serious thought to it. I just sort of do. And then at one point when I'm doing, I think.
You're like, oh, there's a strategy here.
Oh, I should have a strategy.
Discovered what the strategy is.
But I'm pretty good on my feet, so
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned the idea that the people around the time that you were investing were sort of the first generation to grow up with the internet. And there's a lot of talk about digital natives now. Do you think it's almost a separate generation between the people that you invest in sort of the mid to late 2000s versus people who are creating digital companies now?
Every generation has differentials.
Sure.
And you know, even the older millennials versus the younger millennials. Generation Z has different aspects of their life that's interesting to them. And because of that, they will build companies that are important to them in their lives, and they will all do it technology. What I think is really interesting about the next generation, this is coming up the pipeline, who are in, you know, junior high school, elementary school, beginnings of high school, is that not only did they grow up with, like, I'm surprised around all ADD, with all this shit coming at them all day long, they actually are very mindful of wanting to put that aside.
Okay.
I think we will see it as they get older. And the other thing is that not only do they grow up with computers, they grow up with these things in their hands. And because of that, there's also all of these open platforms that are sincerely creative. So at 13 years old, you can actually build something, get an app in the Apple Store. You could launch something on Kickstarter and get your community to put money into it. I mean, that is pretty powerful at 13 years old. So what will happen to those kids when they graduate college? And you know, I think we're going to see a lot more creativity in the decades to come.
A few months ago, I met a Bitcoin entrepreneur. He's 18 years old, and he said that his previous business before what he was doing now was to start a hedge fund.
That's hilarious.
So he started a hedge fund when he was like 13 or 14 and decided that wasn't the business he wanted to be in. So now he's in Bitcoin. It's very indicative to me of sort of that I'm no longer of the most sort of creative, exciting generation.
Well, but also those kids, you can do anything. You can build anything. You can be anything. You know, when I graduated from college, there was kind of this path for there were 4 paths, and you went down one of them.
Right.
Whereas now, you know, 5 years from now, there will be jobs that are available that we don't even know what they are.
Yeah.
And so that's a pretty amazing thing. In many ways, it goes back to what we were hundreds of years ago when everybody had their own little businesses.
So if you're trying to pick winners who are going to exit, let's say between 5 and 10 years from now, have a sale or an IPO or whatever it is, and yet you say that it's hard to even know what jobs will be available 5 years from now, how do you approach that?
I think you look at I look at companies that I feel are filling voids in sectors that make sense to me, that no one has sort of looked at it in that way. Okay. You know, for years people are like, what is it you invest in? Like, besides women and men who have to be at a very high level, is that a lot of I understand consumers. So, you know, what interests me now versus what interests me in 10 years and where I see opportunities is very different. And so there will always be interesting things to invest in. Again, I don't need to have a $1 billion company. And by the way, I don't even think there are that many $1 billion companies. I mean, there are, but there aren't.
Yeah, there might be a lot fewer in about 12 months.
There should be a lot fewer in about 10 months. Or they will go public at supposed a $1 billion company, and the public markets will tell them you are not.
Right. What's maybe we can get this question out of the way early, but what are you really looking for? What or let's say, have you seen, do you have an idea for a company where if you saw that company and it had the right founder, you would say, yes, I love that idea, but you haven't seen the company yet?
I only really did that in one. I mean, I do think about those things. I don't go out there and really look for it per se. Yeah. I have companies that are sort of in the space, so I'll be like, you know, here's what I see. I mean, if you want to take my advice, take it. If you don't, you don't have to, for sure. It's your company, but I would love to talk about what we see. This makes sense. But like, I'm looking for tenacious entrepreneurs, tenacious founders who are super scrappy, that have drank so much of their own Kool-Aid, they're exploding, and that they are agile human beings, that if they realize by Thursday afternoon at 2:30 it's not working, they'll veer left. Yeah. And I think a lot of the most successful ones have been able to say, okay, it doesn't work. What is it? How can we get this thing to work? Like, we're there. And so I think that's interesting. And
so enough Kool-Aid to really sort of get a little, like, really into it, but not enough Kool-Aid to be sort of drunk on their own idea, and
yes,
still capable of navigating different trajectories.
Right, and listening to their audience. Yeah. I think that people get bogged down sometimes in what they believe is going to happen. A perfect example is I'm invested in a company called Tote. It's the first dollar in, and I understood the business. I'd been in the retail and the wholesale world. And they came to me, and I made them take their valuation down significantly. And then I said I would do it. And one of the things I said to them at the beginning is, figure out who your customer is. I was like, you probably think your customer is a 25, 30-year-old hipster who's going to get La Tote in a box and wear it on the weekends. And you might find out she's a 45-year-old woman going to work, and that's what she wants to use it for. So figure out quickly who your customer is, because once you figure her out, you've built your foundation. And they did. I mean, they did a lot of A/B testing, and they figured out who their customer was, and they have just grown constantly since then. But I was right. It wasn't who they thought their customer was.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. How many times, if we use La Tote as the example, how many times have they sort of adjusted along the way in terms of understanding customers?
I mean, I think that once you get your customer, you just have to listen to your customer.
Sure.
I mean, I think, listen, we're seeing that in retail. I mean, Abercrombie & Fitch is a perfect example. I mean, Jesus Christ, as people were lining up on Fifth Avenue and the place just went bankrupt. Right. So you have to wonder, I think it also has to do with supply chain in manufacturing, which has changed dramatically, and they're not paying attention to that and figuring out how these stores need to change. But, you know, never believe you're not capable of failing.
So there are, can we just have a show of hands from the audience? How many people are actively working on a company that they created right now?
Wow.
Wow, that's huge.
That's huge.
How many people have already taken funding? Raise your hand. All right, so maybe 15% of the first crowd. How many people are actively seeking funding for that company? How many
Fundraising
people,
is the worst.
how many people came here specifically because they're seeking funding for their company? Not that many. All right. Why did you come? To learn? All right. That's a good broad statement. How many people have been raising capital for longer than 6 months of the people who are raising? Yeah, it's a tough battle. Sure. Well, yeah, I mean, hopefully not. Hopefully you're not always raising capital. But Joanne, what's the what's the fastest you've seen around close, and what's the slowest you've seen around close that successfully closed?
You know, it always takes longer.
Yeah.
I mean, it really does. And a lot of it is luck. You get in front of the right person that actually, how did you know that on Monday morning the partners were saying we should really get into this business? And you end up meeting with one of them on Wednesday and they're like, boom, boom, you know? You just don't know what's going on behind closed doors. And so, you know, I've seen, you know, I had one company in LA and it was literally your classic, raise the money, then they go out 12 months later, raise more money, go out again 12 months later, raise more money. I mean, with no problem. It looks seamlessly. And it's kind of fascinating. You know, whereas others I've seen struggle constantly, always raising money. And then they finally got to a point where they got institutional money with a huge chunk of change. We're talking $10 million. And life changed. Right. So, you know, it's really hard finding the right person on the other side of the table to believe in what you're doing.
Are there companies that you have personally believed in where you've gone out and really kind of converted skeptical investors to join you in the round?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
I'm shameless when it comes to that.
So one of the things that I hear continuously, and I really hope that is true, is that you're very much a truth teller. Mm-hmm. That you will just sort of tell people like it is, kind of regardless of whether you're going to hurt their feelings or not. And it seems like there's an incredible amount of value in that, especially in maybe, I would say, the last sort of 5 to 8 years of a huge, like, sort of startup hype and you know, explosion of venture capital funds. Do you feel like there are a lot of other people like you out there who, you know, like investors who are really providing a lot of value to their companies by telling them the truth and really sticking it to them when they aren't doing the right thing?
Yeah, I think there's, in general, I think once you have an investor in your company, most of them, you know, are behind you. They're not looking to throw you under the bus. They're there to be supportive. And, you know, there's down times, there's high times, there's great times. I mean, and it's, you know, every company takes on a life of itself. I do think that, you know, it's important to be honest about what you're seeing and what you're hearing, or because each investor comes from a completely different world of provenance that they can bring to the table. And I always preface it, it's like, this is what I think, or here's what's happening, you know, and it's just like what I'm seeing. You know, you don't have to take my advice, right. Because I don't think that is the role of an investor, is to tell a company how to manage and lead their company. I think the role is to be supportive. You make board decisions together and do anything you can to help that founder, be it fire and hire great new staff, or evolve in regards to what the business plan is and how we're going to execute on it, and be there as a sounding board. But at the end of the day, it's a hell of a lot harder for that founder to make those decisions than anybody else.
Sure. You had a great quote in an interview I'd heard, which was basically said, well, it's my advice, but it's your company.
Yeah.
Right. And I really like that a lot.
I think it's really true. I mean, but I mean, listen, there's this guy who emailed me, and it's one of those things like you remember. And so I answer all my emails. And I just think it's so hard being a founder that you deserve a response, because you're out there, you're trying to raise money for your company, something you believe in, and you know, it's nice to respond. Even if the answer is no, at least I looked at it, I acknowledged it. And so this one guy emails me, and he's got this business to do with these computers and these like kiosks that you can recharge in airports. And he's in like 2 or 3 airports in the South, and I think he's putting them in schools. Yeah. And he's in this business, and you know, he's like, I really like the idea, you know, listening to you, and I actually, you know, I love the whole thing with women, and I brought my wife into the business, and you know, I'm looking to raise money now. And he was doing well. You know, he actually was doing really well. He was actually profitable. And I said to him, this is not a venture capital business.
Right.
It's not a venture-backed business. It was like, you've got all these communities in your community. You've got these schools, you've got these airports, you brought in your wife. The 4 of you together in your business now, you could probably build this business to a $20 million business a year, make 4 or 5. Like, why would you want my money?
Right.
Like, go down that path. See how that works. You're wasting all this time because no one's going to invest in this business. Yeah. This is not something that people invest in. Right. At least ones I know. Yeah. And so a year later, I got an email in my box from the same thread. Mm-hmm. He's like, you gave me you're the only one who told me not to do this, and I did what you suggested. And he's like, I think then he's like, and I brought in my wife, and we're profitable, and we like, you know, netted $1 million last year after paying salaries and everything. And I was like, that's awesome. Yeah. You know, because you know, he doesn't have to deal with investors.
Yeah, I think with all the hype, it's like everyone thinks that you have to raise venture capital.
Everybody thinks you should raise money.
Successful business. It's something like, I don't know, a single-digit percentage of successful U.S. companies has ever raised outside capital. There's something like that. And something like 80% of businesses are small businesses. But there's a question from Twitter that I think could be really sort of interesting in terms of your background and kind of what you can bring to the table in terms of being an investor, which is from the Twitter handle is Deals and Divas. Is that anybody here? Deals and Divas? Oh, hey, how's it going? What's your name?
Marcia.
Marcia. All right, thanks, Marcia. So Marcia's question is, well, she says she'd love to know if you've had any failures and why those things failed.
So I've been really lucky. So I'm in a little over 90 businesses actually at this point. And I've been doing it since 2007. And I've had, I think, 5 failures. And the rest are all hanging in there. Some are hanging at a higher level. Some are like, you know, we'll see. I'm sure there will be some that will die, and others that actually will become part of other companies, which is fine. You know, sometimes, you know, a couple of these, what is the whole, one whole is better than the sums of all these different parts, right? So I have 2 that are doing that now, and I think it's going to be a win-win for everybody. One massive failure I had, and it was the best thing that ever happened. I learned so much from that failure. I was on the board. There were so many red flags at the very beginning, but I chose to ignore them. I mean, literally, they were like waving in my face. And I loved the business model. And all the people that were investors in this company were like the who's who. I'm the only one who read the documents. It took us 8 months to close it. We had to restructure the whole thing. And it died and flamed out. He went through $4 million in almost 10 months. Now there was debt and things that he should have renegotiated. It was one, like, he was a very creative guy that didn't listen to the money. And, you know, it was one of those things where you're just like, what the fuck? You go to a board meeting and go, why did you do that? You know, we told you not to do that. And then, you know, he'd go and do it again. I'm like, and he just had like ADD. And so I got a call literally 2 days before Labor Day weekend. And he's just like, yo, Joanne, I can't make payroll. And I was like, what? You know, and so I took it very seriously on how I restructured, redid, brought people in, thought about the business, did anything I could do to keep this thing afloat. And in the end, I basically said, lock the door. you have to lock the door tomorrow, and that will be the end of the business. But there was a lot of components in that deal. And I have to say, fascinating enough, which says something about who do you trust on your team, or who do you believe is this great person with this great resume, or some particular investor that everyone says is fantastic. These are some really amazing investors on this thing. I had 4 of them call me over the next year and say, yo, he's doing something new. You investing? It's like, no. So, I mean, I was a wow. So it was an amazingly exhausting, but I have to say, like, he actually did me a huge solid. It was a great, great thing to blow up in Phoenix.
I think it went off again. There we go. What are you looking for in terms of a founder? So assuming that you are often investing in technical companies where you as an investor just can't. It would take you 2 years to understand the technology behind the product. What are you looking for when an investment comes to you and says, here's this technology we have, or here's the market opportunity? How do you judge the person across the table from you?
At the end of the day, it's all about gut.
Yeah.
I mean, out of the 90 investments I'm in, half of them I gave them first dollar.
Yeah. Perhaps
more, but I haven't found that out yet. It's one of those things where, like, they've moved forward. It's like, oh my God, like, we had this panel for We Festival, and Kate from EduSense was like, and we were down to like no money, and then Joanne was our first 50 in, and it's like, oh my God, we have 2 more months, thank God. And I'm like, what? Now fast forward, she just raised $12 million, so it was actually a good investment. But it's really about the person. And but I've had people that come to me that have like these incredible back-end technologies I wouldn't know in a million years, so I'm not going to invest in something like that.
Yep.
So it's more about the concept and the product and the stickiness that they're already getting. It makes complete sense to me.
I'll say quickly again, if anyone wants to ask a question, tweet it on #StartupGrindNYC. So you mentioned the Women Entrepreneurs Festival, and I'd love to kind of talk a little bit more about that, and then just sort of talk about who you are as a person, because sort of going beyond the fact that you invest in companies, let's talk about sort of the well-rounded person that is Joanne Wilson. So if we could start by just you telling us a little more about what the festival does.
Yeah.
and what it's been to you, that would be great.
So the conversation started 7 years ago with my co-founder, who is no longer involved, although she came. She's great, is a professor at ITP, and she was very frustrated with the classes that year. ITP, if anyone doesn't know, is the Interactive Telecommunications Program at NYU, similar to Media Lab, MIT Media Lab, but it's always been a 50-50 gender, and it's a little more artistic than MIT Media Lab. It's a great program. It was started by Red Burns, who's a legend, and that particular year, she had a couple classes that were 60-40. She was frustrated, and she's like, there's not enough women in tech. And I said, yes, they are. They just network differently. And so she's like, I want to do something to acknowledge them. So she said, I want to do this event. She said, what'd you do with me? And at that point in my life, I was like, sure. And so we started this event. We did it at NYU for 5 years. And we realized literally the first day, we're like, oh my God, we've really tapped into something here. And fast forward, after 5 years, I was done with NYU. And I was done with how it was produced, the whole thing. And I happened to have dinner with my husband and my sister about 2 days before the last festival at NYU. We got very hammered on margaritas. And my husband was just like, you cannot give this up. Yeah. Like, you can't. And my sister was like, well, I'll run it. And that was the end. And so she took it over. And she's like my partner in the business now, which is a godsend. And she's logistics, she's a producer, she's insanely creative, she has great ideas, and we're a really good team. And so we put this event on in April at One World Trade Center. 400 women came. We had amazing sponsors. It's an incredible event, and we're going to grow it. We're going to do it in LA in November, cool. And we're going to do it LA, Berlin, and New York the following year. And then there's a whole other side to it.
Have you seen the landscape of female founders change since you became an angel investor, or since you first were really paying attention?
Absolutely, yeah.
Also?
Well, I think when I started investing, one of the reasons I made a conscious decision to invest in females unless of course some amazing business came by my door that a guy was involved in, had to have a female on the team, is no one was investing in these women. And no one really understood them. And I understood them and I understood their businesses. And it was only, 7, 8 years ago.
Yeah.
But now that's accelerated. And so, I remember meeting with Rachel Chung for breakfast at Catchafire. And she's like, she literally came running after me after breakfast. She's like, it was funny, will you please be my mentor? I was like, I hate that saying. What does that mean? And she's like, well, everyone involved in my business is a man. And I haven't ever had a breakfast like this with someone. So I was like, well, if you still have money in the first round, then I'd be interested. And so, then I got involved with Rachel. So, I really did make that conscious decision to support women. And so, I really do believe that, I have probably, 60 women in my portfolio who are founders. And as these women grow their businesses, some will go public, some will sell their companies, some will start new companies. These ones didn't work out. But as they become more household names and they stay in the press, that we will see a shift in the importance of gender diversity in our communities and a little more bow to these women of these businesses they're building. And by the way, it's the same thing with minorities. I'm supposedly, says Catherine Finney, the #1 angel investor in minorities that have raised over $1 million in this country.
Meaning non-white men.
Blacks and Latinos. And I have to tell you, that's a conscious decision. And many of them are building businesses that the people on the other side of the table don't even get. And those are huge freaking communities. And so I think that it's important, and certainly through social media, that we rise those names to the top so that others around can go, to me, like, God, you were so fucking smart. But more importantly is that then when those people walk in their office, they look at that differently.
Right. From what I've perceived, it seems like there's a huge mentorship opportunity for female entrepreneurs that didn't exist 8 years ago.
Totally.
Because there are just more opportunities for mentorship and people kind of trying to find ways to facilitate women entrepreneurs. Do you think there is an opportunity, if we fast forward another 8 or 10 years, for communities to start merging a little more? Meaning that, do you think there will be more chances for men mentoring women, women mentoring men, people from non-white, non-male populations mixing a lot more? Because right now it seems very much that men invest in men, women invest in women, minorities invest in minorities. How do you see that changing over time?
Well, I think I do think it will change. And as I said, I think it's the same thing what I'm talking about, is that, rising tides can fix a lot of stuff. So I think that's one thing that's super important. And that will shift. There are some men, what some men have said to women that have pitched in is just like unbelievable. Well, how do I know you're not going to get pregnant and have children? I don't want to invest in somebody who's going to, have children. It's like, well, guess what? We are the only ones that can have children. So someone has to have them. But I think that one of the things that will make a big impact is the large companies like Etsy or, Salesforce or Facebook that are essentially forcing men to take 3 months off when their kid is born. And literally, you have to take off that time. So if you have a child, with your partner, wife, husband, whatever it is, and you both stay home those first 3 months, that changes the game from day one. Versus the past where he went off to work and the woman sat there with like diapers hanging off her head. And so I think that will be a very change in males' outlook in regards to the women on the other side of the table.
Do you, so it seems like we're talking about both women as employees, but then women as founders. Do you think just the idea that that policies are more favorable or more equitable between men and women on an employee level will then spur more women to become entrepreneurs or feel more empowered to break away from that company and start their own thing?
If you look at data, women tend to start businesses later.
In age-wise?
Age-wise.
Okay.
Right? In kind of not surprising, women like to cross their T's and dot their I's, which is a good thing and a bad thing. So then when they feel confident and comfortable in something, they can then go on to start businesses. I mean, so many women who I've met have started businesses and said, I always knew I wanted to start a business, but I wasn't ready to start the business. And that's a very different mindset. But I do think that a lot of these social shifts will have long tail effects of employees, founders, everything. I hope so. Because I believed when the internet really started in that business in like the mid 90s, that was going to change the world because these companies were going to be gender neutral and it was going to change everything. I mean, because the first job I was at that I started at Macy's and I charged up the ladder very, very quickly next to all of my counterparts. And I became a buyer in 3 years. And this man literally was like, stop. Women do not move as quickly as men. And I was like, fuck you. And I left. But
good.
You know, a lot of people would not have.
Yeah.
That was who I was. So I think that is going to change.
You had a sort of an ongoing piece in the Wall Street Journal. You were listed, I think, as a mentor.
Oh yeah,
startup mentor.
That was a while ago.
Yeah, there was a piece there that I really liked where you described a certain trait that successful entrepreneurs tended to have, which was lightness, in your words. The idea that someone would come in and they would be confident, just a little bit cocky, and really like very faithful in their idea and ready to charge forward and do whatever it takes. But in that same piece, you also briefly hinted that women tended to not have that as much as men do. Do you think that that's still the case?
Yeah, not as much as anymore, but as there's so many women I've invested in with their first dollar that have then gone on to raise $10, $30 million. And the lightness has gotten much better as they have grown into their own and they think, wait a second, I built this thing.
Right.
I know better than you do. And feeling that confidence versus then they go in at the beginning and there's still this like pushback from the other side. And women tend to say, instead of pushing on back on the other thing. And women are different. I mean, my husband, there was a company that pitched them in San Francisco, and funny enough is they actually ended up investing in that company a year later. And he said, we asked this question. And she said, I don't know the answer, but I will get back to you.
Yeah.
And he goes, I've never seen that. And I said, not enough women are pitching you, obviously, because that's a very, honesty.
Yeah.
But it's hard to be.
It's not a brash answer.
It's not brash, but it's also hard for women who are very honest about, I know next year I'm going to $1.32 million.
Yeah.
A guy will come in there and go, I'm going to $5 million next year. And it's like very hard, even though it's up to the analysts to sort of look at it, but it's important that those women realize what they're competing against. It's also coming in the room. So, you should inflate your numbers too.
So we have about 15 minutes left, and I want to make sure we get more questions from the audience. So there's a great one here. I don't know how to say their Twitter handle exactly, but Janetta Hot. Hey, how's it going? Great. Is that your name?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So she asks, did you have any mentors along the way? Who do you trust to be super honest and challenge you, other than your husband?
Mentors is like one of those words that have come into the world like the last couple years. And I think that mentors are something for everyone that evolved naturally. They could be a peer. They could be someone younger than you, someone older than you. And, you know, I look back obviously in my career, and there were women that I worked for, that like, I actually had gone back and I hooked up recently with a woman, the first woman I ever worked for out of college. She ran the store, and I ran the cosmetic department. And, you know, I thought, oh my God, she's never going to remember me. She was someone who's an investor that was best friends with her, and we ended up getting together. Totally remember me. And it was just so funny to hear her talk about me, of how I saw myself at that age. But I remember thinking to myself, I want to be her, you know? So that was a different kind of mentor. And then I had a woman I worked for, you know, I actually worked for a bunch of women. And then there's this third woman I worked for, and she really wanted my career to succeed. Like, she really, like, she pushed me out. When she ended up getting promoted, she called me and said, I have already talked about you to these people, and we're going to make sure you are on the fast track. But, you know, she was amazing. I'll tell you one funny story is, so when you work in store line, if you've ever been in these department stores and you hear these bells, so the people that work in the store, they have their own bell, you know, so then you know, you bing, bing, bing. It's like, oh, that's me. Someone's calling me. So you go to the phone and you pick up the bell. And anyway, so when I was at Macy's, every 2 months, the senior management, which was the president and the division head and the heads of and all the buyers would come to the store. And it was always mostly men, and the buyers were a majority women. They'd come down in their black suits, you know, it was like a very thing, and you'd stand in your department and you'd be like, you know, spewing out your numbers, you know, because you had to know your business. And Robin called me that day to come upstairs before they were coming to the store. I was wearing a suit. She, on the other hand, I walk upstairs and she's wearing a tight black mini skirt, a tight sweater, and red high heels that high. And she had an incredible figure. And I was like, Robin, don't you know who's coming today? She goes, yes, I do. And I was like, wow, note to self, use what you got.
All assets. Talisa D has an interesting question. Where's Talisa? Hey, how's it going? Oh, yeah, great. So she says, the gender gap in tech is slowly closing, but have you seen any increase in women venture capitalists?
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. You know, particularly in analysts, who, for whatever reason, actually, you know, I know the reason is I think women like to be part of teams. And so they go and they become these investors, which, by the way, being an investor is a very lonely job. You know, you meet with your group on Monday, your partners, and then you're on your own. And your community is really your businesses. You know, yes, you've got your partners to bounce things off, but the reality is you're on your own. And most of the women analysts end up going to work for companies or going back to business school because they want to be part of a team. And I have actually was in San Francisco in January, and I went to this event. I met all these analysts, and I said to them, don't leave, you know, come back. Like, you're all really good at what you do. And at one point you will have your community, or you'll have your children and you'll have that community, and you can come back and be an investor and not feel that you need to have a community in your work life as much as you do now. But I am seeing more women, and I can tell you, because I have a relationship with a lot of the male teams and venture capitalists across the country, a lot of calls to say, we really want to hire a woman, you know, venture capitalist.
As a partner.
As a partner, do you know anyone? And I have had that. I actually had someone talk to who they're taking a quarter of their fund and putting it in LPs, and only LPs, they are LPs and only putting it into funds that have a woman partner. So yes, that is definitely changing, and I think that's great.
So we have another question from Mina Salib, which I think Mina, there's Mina right there. His question is, what are your thoughts about the VR and artificial intelligence craze? Do you invest in those industries? And I think if I could expand that generally, can you talk about some of the industries that you are most interested in?
VR, no. That's it.
Do you care to elaborate?
I don't believe it.
You don't believe in it?
I don't. I see this as a blip in the road to something else. And as a venture capitalist, you should invest in it. because you will learn from it. You might not make any money, but your LPs pay you, put money in you to educate your minds in a particular area. And so I think that's a really good thing. And I think it's great for the economy. It's great for jobs. It's great for innovation. I don't want to be involved in something that's the first generation of something that I'm not even positive. I'm not even sure about it. I'm not even sure how it's going to evolve. AI, I think, is very interesting. And again, I really believe in it. I really believe in it. I haven't seen anything. I'm not so sure I would invest in it, but I do think that it's going to be a game changer for us over the next 20 years. Yes.
Along those lines, do you have a preference to software, more lightweight products versus hardware and things that have high capital costs? Do you think that's part of it?
I've done both.
Yeah.
So I'm not partial to either or, because my thesis has been a broad one over the last 8-9 years. I think I'm focusing a little more on my thesis now going forward, because I only invest in one thing per vertical, because I don't think that you can support multiples in one vertical. I don't think it's authentic. And I don't want to see companies building better mousetraps that have already had a huge amount of funding and are just hitting their stride. Not that they can't be disrupted too, but you know, it's not something that excites me. I think it's also a harder battle uphill. You know, for me, the arenas that I think are really interesting now is agriculture, particularly because of phones. You know, that you could have literally someone picking a strawberry, taking a photo, putting a number to it, and it can get all the way to Sweetgreens, and we'll know who ate it and where it came from, because they can do that, right? You can't like have someone run off to a software system and plug in how many strawberries. So I think that's really interesting. I think technology is going to really change agriculture. And when 40% of our food goes to waste, that's like it's something waiting to be fixed. And I'm very interested in the cannabis industry. I think that in 5 years from now, it's going to be a free-for-all, that we're going to be able to, in 10 years from now, you're going to be able to buy it at 7-Eleven. And so I think that that is a really interesting opportunity.
Do you think they'll sell it at Sweetgreen?
Probably. Yeah.
Are there other things that are maybe passions for you, where you really like talking to entrepreneurs in that arena? You aren't necessarily ready to mobilize dollars there, but you're just really passionate about it.
You know, I've always been one of those people that read like a bunch of nonsense for your head so that you can sort of just, you know what's going on sort of in a big picture kind of way. You know, jack of all trades, master of none.
Yeah.
But I really love the design world. I always have. And I really, I love the whole building, architect, construction world. And I have a lot of investments in that area.
Right.
I've always been passionate about the food industry. You know, I'm a huge book reader. And I love to travel, but I would never invest in a travel app. You know, I mean, the reality is I probably invest in things that I really just understand.
How long do you take to try to understand something before you kind of move on to the next thing?
In terms of, what do you mean?
I mean, let's say that someone in the audience pitched you on something that you weren't at all familiar with. Would you spend an hour with them? Would you spend trying to understand
the business? No.
No.
I know what I know. That's how I've always operated.
Yeah. So if it's not something that you can grasp in kind of
Right.
5 minutes or less,
Yeah.
then.
I mean, listen, I think biotech is a fascinating place to be in right now.
Yeah.
But honestly, like, I'm a one-man band. I have no analysts behind me. I think the companies that invest in that have a whole group of them behind me. I could go back to my office and say to my assistant, like after talking to someone, oh my God, that person's amazing. What a great idea. And someone else who was actually an analyst would say, there's 100 of them. You know, and I'd be like,
Right.
Really? So, I mean, I don't know that arena well enough to make intelligent decisions. I did invest in some healthcare stuff early on, but there was different things happening then. Now it's just been an explosion.
Yeah. There was another great comment that I'd heard from you at some point, which was that if something is not sort of immediately obvious, then it's not going to be obvious to the customer either. And I think that makes all the sense in the world, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
if if I had a company and I'd pitch you in 30 seconds and you had no idea what the hell I was talking about, then unless my customer is someone who's completely and extremely technical and a business somewhere over there, then it's not going to make sense to them.
Right. Now, listen, if you're dealing with consumers, business to business is different.
Yeah.
Back-end technologies are different. But when you're dealing with consumers, I mean, when I was in the garment center, they had a saying, which is, if you want to hang with the classes, you have to sell to the masses. And it's a great saying, because that's how big businesses are built. It's selling to hundreds and thousands and millions of people. And I think that one of the things that we all do as founders of these companies is that we feel that we need to be in New York and San Francisco, or these massive, the two connections, right? Even as we grow our companies, who our customers are. And I saw a company that I ended up not investing in just because I came late to the party and they couldn't take enough of my money and it wasn't worth it for me. But what I loved is that he was raised on a farm and he was in northern Canada and he built this food business that was delivery, really. I mean, whatever, we'll see how that works out, the delivery business. But what was interesting is that he was entering the United States and he was going to Cincinnati and Cleveland. And I thought that was genius. And I'm in other companies where I'm like, do not go to San Francisco next. Go to Atlanta.
Yeah.
There would be so happy to have you.
Right.
And so I think that is, something to think about as we grow our businesses, is that, I'm in this one business now in Los Angeles. Again, it's in the fast food casual business, but they could have 150 chains from San Diego to Seattle,
yeah,
and be a fabulous business.
Yeah.
And so I think that's important to think about as we grow our businesses.
Are you familiar with Steve Case and his Rise of the Rest idea? He's the former founder of AOL.
No, I know Steve.
Yeah.
No, I don't know. What's his idea?
He has this whole bus tour. He traveled the country on this Rise of the Rest tour. His thesis being that the next major companies are going to be coming out of Milwaukee and out of Detroit and out of cities that are not on the coast. And he is at least pushing that idea very strongly.
Listen, I think that's really interesting. I would hope so. But the bottom line is then there has to be money in those cities.
Yeah.
Because unfortunately, for whatever reason it is, many of the big investors in Silicon Valley if you have a big company in Iowa,
yeah,
oh, you got to move here.
Right.
Which is utter bullshit. But regardless, if I was from Cleveland, I would be hanging in Cleveland. If I was from Detroit, I'd be moving back there and just seeing as much as I possibly can to help the community. And but I'm a New Yorker.
Yeah.
But I think that how we're going to make those cities really do well is there has to be more capital.
Sure. Yeah, and there's not enough of an ecosystem. I mean, Silicon Valley, started with Intel, and they've had, before Intel, they had literally generations of capital that's cycling through all these companies.
Right.
Even New York is now sort of building that back up again, but a lot of the smaller cities don't have that.
They don't have the capital.
Yeah.
But I think for angel investors or micro funds, that's really interesting to be in those cities, because A, you're putting money back into your community, and B is, those type funds that I think will be the most successful in many ways over the next decade that are $30 million funds. You don't have to have $1 billion exit. You can have a company that exits at 50 or 80 or $100 million, and it doesn't cost as much money to start these businesses.
Right.
And I think more people are really thinking thoughtfully about, how do I become profitable? How do I do this intelligently?
So I know you actually have to run, so we're going to wrap it up. I'm going to ask you just one more question. Typically with all of our startup grind events, we actually try to hear people from the audience, but since you have to run, we might wrap it up with you first, and then we'll do an audience portion after you head out, if that's all right.
Yeah, it's fine.
Great. But so the final question to you is, what are you most excited about in the next 12 months? What do you know, if you were to fast forward 12 months from now, what do you think you would see, and how would the ecosystem have shifted?
And I'm really excited about the companies that I'm invested in now that are well-funded, that many of them will become profitable over the next 12 months, that will, you know, either continue growing as a profitable company, or they'll go out and raise money later on down the line. But I really am focused on what I have now and the multiple boards that I sit on. I mean, not that I'm not seeing stuff all the time in decks, but there's very few things that are coming my way that I get excited about these days.
Sure.
We talked about this a little earlier, is the ecosystem has changed with capital. Not that there's not tremendous amount of capital out there still, but people are holding back their capital. They're being more thoughtful about their capital. You know, a lot of the ones that raise money, they're now looking to raise more money as micro VCs, haven't yet to prove that they're successful. So we're seeing a lot of that mess. But, you know, I think as investors, you do start to see things in people and think, are they going to be able to raise another round?
Right.
And you have to.
Yeah. And what's the time frame to raise a Series A or Series?
Right. And so, you know, it's tougher out there. There's no doubt. I mean, not that companies aren't getting funded, and not that, you know, I think if you got a great company, you will always get funded. But it's going to be a little more of a slog.
Sure. All right.
All right, great. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate it.